general can't require additional training. There's already training that happens at the police standards and training for recruits. Many police departments in the state also engage in training with their officers as well. So that's something that does happen on a regular basis.
Now, the AG's office can't require training?
No, we can't dictate to police officers what training they have to have. That's up to their department and police standards. We can certainly weigh in on those types of questions and have weighed in on that type of question in the past, but we can't dictate to police officers what training they get.
Well, I know there's a grant now that, I apologize.
That's all right.
I really meant to turn that off.
We're all chained to those.
I meant to turn that off. Yeah, I forgot where I was.
You asked about mandatory training.
Yeah, in the new grant application that NAMI and I believe it's state police are working on together, they talk about this new training program that is going to give at least 75 troopers more equipment, more training to deal with these issues. Do you think that's going to reduce the number of officer-involved shootings that are likely to occur in the future?
So that's a good question. That's something that's been asked before. Certainly more training could be helpful. I mean, officers deal with people with mental health issues on a day-to-day basis. In any given week, there might be hundreds of interactions throughout the state where police officers are dealing with people who have mental health issues or a combination of other issues. And thankfully, those interactions don't end up in violent episodes. But for police officers, they're really downstream of the problem, meaning that by the time an individual is approaching a police officer with a deadly weapon and has created a deadly force situation, the time for help for that person is probably past at that point, and whether it's a private citizen or a police officer, they're acting to try to preserve their own life or someone else's. So there's no doubt that that type of training would help police officers, but in these fast-moving, dangerous situations, it's probably not going to be that helpful. The hope is that you get further upstream and really help that person before it gets to the situation that the officer and that person are in at that moment.
Can you tell me a little bit about the protocol once an officer-involved shooting occurs? What is the protocol for what the next steps are?
Sure. Well, these are treated like every other criminal and homicide investigation that we engage in. We assign at least 2 prosecutors to the case. One's a more senior member of the office. Those 2 work with a lead investigator from the State Police Major Crime Unit and a team of detectives to investigate the case. And that includes determining who the witnesses are in the case, obtaining physical evidence, any documentary digital evidence, examining the scene or scenes, conducting witness interviews, and it could also entail things like forensic work and potentially investigative grand jury work. And that's something that occurs in every homicide case that we do, some more than others.
Mm-hmm.
And the goal is to determine what happened, determine the facts, and then apply the law to those facts. And the way we handle it here in the office is, if it's determined to be, at the conclusion of the investigation, if it's determined to be justified, we issue a comprehensive report that's made public, and we also hold a press briefing where we present the facts and our findings and take questions at that point.
Mm-hmm. I think we've talked about this before. Do you know roughly how many lawsuits have been brought against state troopers? I know you wouldn't be aware of the other cases.
I don't. That's not something I get involved with. That's completely separate.
Completely separate. And I think there's been some talk that because the Attorney General's office also handles the civil cases for state agencies such as New Hampshire State Police, that perhaps an outside prosecutor should investigate these matters. Do you think the AG's office can be truly unbiased when they represent civilly the state police?
I don't think that concern's ever been raised with me or anyone else who does these cases. We have a strong policy here, and that policy is that we abide by the law. That's what we take an oath to do. We also have the rules of professional conduct, and that guides what prosecutors in this office do. We have no role in whatever civil proceedings have to happen after the fact, and the civil attorneys who are assigned to those cases, don't have any interactions with the criminal prosecutors as well. So we keep things absolutely separate. We each have our own obligations, And also there's different law and rules that apply to each one. And then the office is also set up to handle any potential conflict. So if we had an actual conflict, we could certainly substitute in other prosecutors if we needed to. And there's been one instance in the office where a close relative of a suspect in an Officer Ralph shooting incident worked in this office, and we conflicted out, and we had another agency handle it. So we have policies and procedures set up to handle those types of situations. But we're certainly skilled enough and capable enough to be able to separate our various duties and obligations, and it has not been a problem.
Are you still in charge of the department that handles these cases? I know you've
Yes.
been promoted. Congratulations.
Yeah, still, I didn't give up the homicide chief stuff, so I still have that.
Oh, good, good.
I guess that's one way to look at it, Nancy.
So,
How many hats do you want to wear?
Oh, I wear way too many hats, and
you
I'm
know
sure
exactly
you
what it's
do
like,
as
right?
well.
You know.
I do know. Have any of these cases ever been, except for the Tony Prevero case, which we discussed, have any been brought before a grand jury?
Yes, there have been other cases where we've done investigative grand jury work.
On officer-involved
Yes.
shootings? Can you tell me roughly how many and what the results were?
It's been a handful, I think. It's not that common. Most of the time, we're able to resolve issues just with witness interviews and other techniques, but sometimes we do need to use the grand jury. So I don't have an exact number.
And if a death isn't justified, wouldn't it be some type of homicide, whether or not it's manslaughter or the one step down from manslaughter?
Negligent homicide.
Negligent homicide.
Well, every death is a homicide. The
Uh-huh.
question is whether or not it's justified under the law.
And so if it's not justified, wouldn't that require it to fall under some category such as negligent homicide or?
Well, the grade of the crime doesn't dictate what the result is. That's simply how it fits under the criminal code. So depending on the circumstances, you would classify it anywhere from a negligent homicide to a manslaughter, second-degree murder, first-degree murder, up to capital murder. But whether it's justified or not depends on the facts and circumstances as to whether or not the person who acted, the actor in the case, used deadly force, complied with the law, and whether or not their self-defense claim was valid, and whether or not the state can disprove that claim beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's what dictates whether or not someone gets charged.
Uh-huh.
Just like when a private citizen intentionally kills someone in their home or kills someone who's threatening themselves or a loved one, they have committed, that's a homicide crime, but the question is whether or not they were justified under the law by self-defense.
And were those the questions that you brought to the grand jury in those handful of cases?
So grand jury matters are confidential, so I can't discuss what we said or didn't say in grand jury.
Oh, well, clearly no indictment resulted, correct? Or we would have
Well,
maybe heard.
prosecutors go to the grand jury for two reasons. One is to seek an indictment, the other is to use the grand jury as an investigative tool where witnesses are brought in to testify. So just because prosecutors go before the grand jury with witnesses does not mean that they're necessarily seeking an indictment at that time.
Oh, so those cases could have involved just trying to get more investigative matters.
Right. Sometimes witnesses are reluctant to speak to the police, and so prosecutors have to use the grand jury process in order to secure the information from them.
And relative to the protocol, now let's say a shooting has occurred. What has to happen immediately after? Is the officer placed on leave or paid leave, or is there some sort of counseling provided for the police officer? I'm sure that it's very stressful for the officer involved.
So we don't dictate that part of the process to the police departments. That's up to them administratively, but in our experience, every officer is placed on paid administrative leave at that point, and they typically don't go back to work until the criminal investigation is complete, and then most agencies also do their own internal investigation. So typically they don't go back to full duty until after those two things are complete. Whether it's a private citizen or police officer, people who are involved in these situations are often traumatized, and it's to varying degrees because they've been in a life and death situation. These are not situations that people want to be in, and people react very differently to these situations afterwards. But in our experience, talking to people, again, whether they're private citizens or police officers, it's something that weighs very heavily on them, and they're deeply affected. It's not uncommon for people to seek out counseling afterwards, and sometimes police officers decide they simply don't want to return to duty.
How often does that happen? I hadn't
It's
seen
pretty-
any
it's
cases.
pretty rare.
Pretty rare?
But it does happen occasionally, and certainly, you know, it leaves a significant impact, again, whether it's a private citizen or a police officer, when you talk to them, when we've spoken to those people after these incidents.
Mhm.
You know, this is not a situation, you know, it's not a movie, no one's high-fiving, you know, this is a devastating situation for everyone involved.
Mhm.